Well, you're raising the dead or shooting for the stars. Well, you can't go wrong with a potty mouth guitar.
All right. Welcome back to Potty Mouth Guitar. You are looking at Earl Potty Mouth Arbuckle. And we are continuing with the clear coat of the Pottycaster guitar that I'm building for Stacy Shea Williams. And I've got the prep work done already. I've got the body taped up. Got these little plugs in the ferrule holes so we don't fill those up with epoxy. And I've got some sheetrock screws just substituting for the neck plate screws just to hold their place so epoxy doesn't seep in there, or if it does, I can get it out more easily. Anyway, pardon me. And this should be a fairly simple little procedure, and following from the pour that we did on the front. So, and that turned out really, really well. I'm very pleased with the clear coat. There's a little bit of bubbles, a little bit of imperfections on the surface, but if the YouTube videos I've watched are any indication, we should be able to get rid of that business. So, I have done one more plastic container. I measured it with one cup broken into two half cups. So I've got hashtags marked. I've took a measuring cup, half cup measuring cup, filled it full of water, poured it in here, marked the level, left that water in there, and then poured another half cup in there, and then marked that level, and then poured that out and let this dry. And it's careful to let this dry. I've actually gotten water on curing epoxy. Oh, pardon me. It makes it cloudy. I haven't seen what happens if you mix water into, or have water in the container that you're trying to mix epoxy, but I imagine there would be some clouding problems. It may dissipate as the water evaporates. I don't know, but I sure as heck do not want to risk that. So we're going to go ahead and pour some epoxy. We're going to mix it up, and we're going to pour it onto, or mix it for 3 minutes, pour it into another container, mix it in there for another 3 minutes, and then pour. The reason is you basically want to make sure that all the epoxy, all the material that makes it onto your body is evenly mixed. So I did this same method the last time, and I'm glad I did because it gives a good indication of why you should. Because as I was getting ready to do this video, I used a plastic soda cup that they'd given me at a fast food restaurant. I'd saved that cup to reuse for something, and so I did the initial mix in that soda fountain cup, and it was a clear plastic soda fountain cup. I mixed it in there, and then I poured it into one of these Talenti sorbet containers, and mixed it for another 3 minutes in there, and then poured it from there. Now, the reason I'm glad I did that is I reached into that soda container because I was thinking, oh, I'll see if I can pull out the epoxy, the dried epoxy that's adhered to the inside of this cup, and maybe even reuse the cup again. And when I reached in there, there was sticky epoxy. So it had been sitting here for a week. So that was not perfectly mixed epoxy that had been sitting in that cup. And if I had, by chance, just gone the lazy route and left the epoxy in that one cup and then poured from there, and I had somehow scraped some of that unmixed epoxy onto the mix and had some, basically a pool of hardener or a pool of the resin without the necessary counter ingredient, I would have had a sticky spot on my guitar. And I don't even want to imagine what it's going to take to contend with that. Sorry about the yawn. Anyway, that's just going to happen because I'm a sleepy dude. I don't sleep a whole lot. So I have that insomnia thing. So I've got my 2 jugs of Envirotex Light epoxy. And and it's very important that you get equal portions of the 2 materials. Because once again, same thing. Uneven hardening. If you get a mix that is light on hardener, it may end up taking an extra week or something to harden, even if it does eventually harden. And again, yeah, I wouldn't want to have to deal with that. Trying to make sure bugs aren't getting in it or debris, dust, and whatnot. Okay. So we've got the 2. We've got that weird unequal substances. I'm going to use a table knife, a butter knife. I've got about a jillion knives, so I decided to sacrifice one knife for the cause rather than continually replace popsicle sticks. And another thing that I learned last time is I have to tame my beard when I'm doing epoxy. I just had my beard au natural last time, and I kept dipping my beard in the epoxy. And in fact, my current strategy is going to be to literally tuck my beard into my shirt. And I'm going to go ahead and snap my shirt up and button it so that hopefully my beard won't escape. Because, beard like mine, as long as it is, you never know what it's dragging in. And I try to keep it out of my food and my epoxy, especially my epoxy. And luckily, the epoxy is actually a workable substance for a good half an hour or so after you've mixed it. So when I had lots of epoxy in my beard, so I just ran it under hot water, saturated my beard and my hands with dish soap, and that liquid dish soap, and just used it like shampoo in my beard. Suds my beard up, suds my hands up, and because the chemicals hadn't hardened, they haven't dissipated, they're actually still soluble with warm water and lots of detergent. And I managed to get it out of the beard and didn't have to cut a foot off of my beard. Hallelujah. So this process doesn't generally yield a whole lot of talking, so get ready for that. Oh, and another thing I'm going to need to do for sure today is to do some applying of epoxy to some points on the edge where I kind of have little tiny spots where the epoxy didn't quite cover the sides, and I was primarily wanting to make sure that the top of the guitar, the downside, the one that's facing down right now, that was the primary goal, is make sure we get a good clear coat there. But I was consciously using my palette knife, my oil painter's palette knife, to take epoxy material and spread it onto the sides. But there's just a few spots all the way around that have little dry spots that don't have any epoxy covering. So we're going to try and paint those on. Might even just use this knife. Probably work just as good as anything. I was using a palette knife before. Palette knife actually might be better, but I'm reluctant to try and dig it up now that I'm in the middle of doing this. I'm actually looking at it right through this. It's in that tub right there. But anyway, another thing I need to talk about with epoxy is that I've had some experience. I've done one other body, tried to apply epoxy to it and as a clear coat, and I had not yet learned that you need to seal the grain of the guitar before using epoxy, because the grain of the wood, especially a rougher grain like ash that has some sort of darker veins to it, that sort of more wood that has a bit larger pores like ash. Now we're going to go ahead and do the pour into the new container. Get as much of it in here. Certainly, I'm not trying to leave material behind, but I don't want any. I do want to leave behind anything that's unmixed, or at least get the unmixed stuff in here in such a way that it can get mixed. I think this is a good safety and a good instruction, because it does truly, it gets the materials that have already been pretty well blended into the second container. The stuff that's left behind here is very likely stuff that kind of got isolated on the side and never quite got mixed up with the other stuff. So we're already got a couple of drips. This epoxy method is very messy. It's quick. You don't have to do a whole lot of coats of this and then sand in between the coats and then put another coat on and then sand that coat and then put. It's like the polyurethane methods are extremely time consuming and very, very labor intensive. Now this is kind of time consuming because it does take a bit to cure, but while it's curing, you're not having to reapply and sand and reapply and sand and reapply and sand a whole bunch of times. So the labor factor is greatly diminished, and the finish ends up being very encourages a kind of a 3D sort of magnetism, magnetic or not magnet, magnify, magnify. It magnifies the grain and the features of the wood. So that's why I wanted to use this, especially on the front of this guitar, because the etching. So it's already 3D, and if I use this material that's going to kind of highlight that 3D with a thick, clear coating, that's exactly the effect I wanted. So, anyway, so we're going to go ahead and start that, what I was talking about, and do a little painting. I'm going to do a little rotating here. Take my glasses off because the glare on my glasses obscures the flaws in the... Aha, so we got a spot right here. And while the bubbles, see all the bubbles in this epoxy, there's a whole lot of bubbles suspended in there. I'm going to try and let those dissipate some. And while that's happening, I'm going to do this. I'm really liking how the epoxy and the glitter interact, because the epoxy kind of gives the glitter that sort of permanently wet look. So super glossy, very, very reflective. And of course, glitter, that's glitter's whole thing, reflecting. So making an ultra reflective surface even more reflective. And that's my jam with glitter. And yeah, it makes me want to do a all glitter body. See how that would look. I actually have a buddy who has a Telecaster. It's actually a Fender Custom Shop Telecaster with copper glitter. Okay, so this is a problem that we're going to have to try to avoid. And I'm actually starting to think that I might need to do the sides in a separate deal, because this epoxy is definitely running down and it's going to pool on the top, and we need to avoid that for sure. So we already have a clear coat on the top. We do need a whole bunch of accumulated beads of beads of epoxy in the back. All right, so we're going to just go ahead and forget that business, and I'm going to do a little cleanup. I've got some solvent that will take care of that epoxy, some xylene, and I'll do that. Actually, I should do that before I pour the front. So while those bubbles are dissipating a little further, I'm going to get xylene and a rag. Mm-hmm. Picked a weird spot to cut for a rag. There we go. Hopefully we'll have I think I turned it into some sort of kind of... Oh, there we go. Whew! We're good. Hit that with the xylene. I'm going to throw this rag out the yard. Whew. Okay. There's a little chaos for you. All right. So the bubbles are definitely coming to the top. Let's get our lost the straw. All right. This is going to be one of those episodes, I think. Dipsy-doo. Nope. Oh boy. There we go. Haha. So I'm dissipating the bubbles. Trying to get as many of them out as possible before we pour. But it's about time we do that thing. All right, so that was a bad idea to try and do the touch-ups. That's all right. I do stupid things pretty much every time. And I'll probably get that rag again and do some cover-up or touch-up on the cleaning once I finish this pour. But I'm glad I got what I got dissipated off of it. Or wiped off of that before it was a good idea to be able to turn it over and make sure I had covered spots. All right, and I'm going to want to monitor the edges and make sure that I don't get any seepage through. But even if it does happen, even if I do have some beads of epoxy form on the front of the guitar, the whole idea is that epoxy bonds to epoxy, and through the process of laying epoxy over epoxy, it will bond to itself, and it self-levels. So I should be able to use buffing and sanding to basically make all the seams between the different pores I'm doing invisible. So you won't be able to tell where the top coat was poured as opposed to the bottom coat. And anyway, all right, so the whole thing about this is that it's super easy because all you do is just pour it on, and that's what we're going to do right now. It's kind of nerve-wracking to do so because you just sort of, this is the point of no return. Get that ferrule area, make sure that those areas between those get up in the horn. I'm just going to kind of let pour out whatever wants to. You can definitely see bubbles in the surface. They're going to, I was definitely introducing them as I was mixing the epoxy. It just is inevitable. It's going to happen. I imagine if you have a vacuum mixer of some sort, that would be super cool, but I don't know, maybe some laboratory supply company or something would have something like that. That would be cool, but I imagine it might not be very cost effective depending on how much resin you pour. So let's go ahead and rather than spread it around with an instrument, let's just let gravity do its thing. Kind of thinking, ooh, that wasn't smart. That's on the floor and over the edge. Yippee! I wasn't paying attention to how thick that is. Darn swoosh. Yeah. All right, we got epoxy on the floor. It's a nice hardwood floor, but this house is very old. So, I'll be able to get that up with the xylene without any problem. All right, now we've got it covered for sure with a thick coat. Oops, we got the bottom here. Let's see if we can do that without pouring epoxy all over the floor again. And in the meantime, we'll see if I can manage to remember to not step in it. Because, trust me, there's no guarantees that that's not going to happen. All right. cool thing about epoxy too is that it does not adhere to plastic, so I can use this whatever, Sterilite storage bin thingy to use as a catcher for the runoff, and without having to worry about ruining it completely, even though it doesn't actually belong to a oh, actually it does. I do have a anyway, I have a bin that belongs to that, but let me get that rag. I'm going to clean that mess up. Okay, we get that off there. And sure enough, I did step in it. Gosh almighty. I am just one of those inevitable disasters. Okay. So, got a little shiny spot on the floor now. I'm going to exile this rag. I really should be using a face mask with that xylene. It's very toxic stuff. But anyway, it's out of the house now. So, what we need to contend with now is bubbles. And the magic cure is literally a straw. I've seen a lot of videos, people use heat. They do it very effectively. Perhaps you can too. I have tried to use heat as a way to dissipate bubbles, and it does work, but I always end up baking the epoxy. I end up hardening the epoxy inadvertently with the heat. So I don't trust myself with heat around epoxy. So I use the straw method. And this is a time where I get the most beard messes going on. As I'm doing this, I was talking earlier about making sure to seal the wood and how I've done other projects and didn't know that I needed to seal that wood. Now what happened to me as a result of that is that I didn't just have the bubbles that I'm getting rid of now. These are the ones that I introduced into the epoxy when I was mixing it. And also there's a chemical process as the epoxy mixes. I think that it kind of produces its own bubbles in a little way, but don't quote me on that. I'm not a chemist. But I seem to recall somebody explaining that as part of the process. But the important thing is that I didn't realize that if a porous wood like this is not properly sealed before a coat like this is applied, which is not a porous coat. This is a sealing coat in and of itself. So, not only because I hadn't sealed the wood on this other project, when I put the epoxy over it, I'm dissipating the bubbles and I'm getting rid of bubbles, but I start seeing, it's like, where are these bubbles magically appearing? Like, I'd get a section completely clear of bubbles. I'm like, perfect. And then I'd go around the thing, and then I'd come back to that other spot, and I'd be like, where did these bubbles come from? And, you know, I'm saying to myself, oh, chemical process. And I'm also saying to myself, there are a lot of people out there with perfect clear coats. That's one of the reasons why they use this stuff. It gives such a perfect mirror finish. And if there were a problem or an irreversible problem, especially of bubbles appearing in the clear coat, then it wouldn't have the reputation it does as this mirror finish phenomena, right? So what it turned out to be was that because I had not sealed the wood, the air that was trapped in the wood itself, in the grains of the wood, once that epoxy was laid on it and was slowly seeping into those little nooks and crannies where air was trapped, and that trapped air was getting replaced by epoxy, and that trapped air was trying to find a new home skyward. So these little bubbles were working their way out of the grain of the wood and just kept coming and kept coming as the epoxy dried. And sure enough, when we got to the point where, you know, the epoxy was hardening, and the attempts to, you know, blow bubbles out of this, like I'm doing here, where you get this kind of, see the ripples. Either the ripples weren't happening or the ripples were permanent, because I was catching the liquid in its transformation from liquid to solid. So, rump-ta-dee-dump-tum-tum is where we're at right now. And I'm going to come around and do a pass on the front with the straw. And then I'm going to take the bin, a plastic bin, an empty plastic bin, and put it over this so that no pesky flies or unexplainably airborne dust particles don't decide to introduce themselves into this beautiful finish. And boy, this is looking great. I just love the way this epoxy just makes the grain pop on this wood. All right, see if I can get by here without kicking the camera. All right. And this is going to work even better because last time we didn't have this taped off, so there was lots of material, the epoxy, in the lid. So when I put this covering over it, I ended up basically gluing this to the lid temporarily. And I don't think we're going to have that effect this time, which is good because when I take it back off, all that adhesive strings up, and I don't want to introduce little strings of dried epoxy onto the surface. So we're going to just let it sit here, make sure it doesn't get dusty. And I can say thank you so much for dropping by to watch me pour this epoxy coat. Hopefully it's going to turn out as great as it seems like it's doing. Thank you for Stacy Shea Williams for purchasing this beautiful guitar. Can't wait to get it to you. And thank you to Make Every Media, my production company that is so gracious. It's run by Michael Furstenfeld, who came up with the idea and is the proprietor. And he was good enough to agree to help me produce these shows. So I'm grateful, very grateful for his help. Grateful to Seth Cleveland, who's over there at Make Every Media doing editing. Also Ross Victor. And I'm especially grateful to Health Alliance for Austin Musicians, the Sims Foundation here in town, and the Prostate Cancer Foundation for reasons you know if you know about Earl Pottymouth Arbuckle. We'll talk about that some other time, or you can see some other video where I've talked about it before. But today we're just going to clear coat and get in and out. So thanks so much for dropping by. Thanks to everybody for helping out. Talk to you later. Love you all.
Well, you're raising the dead or shooting for the stars. Well, you can't go wrong with a potty mouth guitar.